Hello and welcome to this new edition of the Arctic Summer College. I'm glad you're joining us today from wherever you are. My name is Max Grünig from the Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. Today we have two speakers. Let me introduce our first speaker first for the first hour. I'm very glad to have here Roman Sidortsov. He's Assistant Professor for Energy Policy at Michigan Technological University. He holds a PhD in Polar Studies and Geography and has also a JD in Environmental Law and from various other degrees as well. I'm actually very impressed by the amount of degrees he has accumulated. So we will be expecting a very high level lecture here that has both a polar energy and maybe governance and legal background in it. Mr. Sidortsov has been teaching at Vermont Law School in their summer and distance learning program and was their senior global energy fellow, and has also experienced in that regard with many webinars, I presume. So the expectations are very high here, of course. I will quickly just introduce what he's talking about before handing over. So this will be about Arctic energy and the laws that govern it. A circumpolar overview is the title, and this gives you already a hint. We have entered now the second thematic segment of the Arctic Summer College. After the first 2 weeks focusing on the change in the environment in the Arctic, we're now focusing for 2 weeks on energy and natural resources. And this is, of course, a gradual change, but it's a very interesting new topic presented here. So it's the first energy session of the Arctic Summer College this year. Thank you, Roman, for being here and for presenting. And as always, we will have time for question and answer after the presentation, and you can either raise your hand or ask your question in the question pane, or send us a message in the chat function, and we'll try to see that, and we'll try to give you either the possibility to ask your question directly if your microphone is working and allows this and it's not too loud in the background, or we can also ask your questions for you should you be in an environment that requires this. So much for housekeeping. Roman, I've talked enough, so the floor is yours, and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you for this wonderful introduction and putting that pressure on me. So I will proceed accordingly. Also, thank you to all the members of Ecologic Institute for inviting me. It is really a pleasure. My only wish is that I could see this diverse and awesome audience that we have today, but I hope to hear from you. So without further ado, let's proceed. So what are we going to talk today about? So we will start with talking about Arctic resource narratives. As people who are interested in the region, you probably have heard or have read a story at least or two about what is happening in the Arctic, why it is happening in the Arctic, and what drives what is happening in the Arctic. So, and then we will jump to the so-called A5, and we will talk about, I will provide a brief introduction to the history and the current state of resource extraction, oil and gas extraction in Canada, Greenland, Denmark, United States, Norway, and the Russian Federation. As you see, the Arctic 5 countries are arranged in a bit of a strange way. When I normally deliver lectures like this, I normally go from east to west or from west to east. But here I arranged the countries in the order of, I would say, activity in the Arctic and Subarctic in terms of oil and gas extraction. So without further ado, let's move on. So you probably have heard this narrative. You probably have seen these numbers, and read different interpretations of these numbers. So that the Arctic is the last energy frontier, and it contains 13% of world's undiscovered oil, 30% of world undiscovered natural gas, and if you know what it is, 20% of undiscovered natural gas liquids. So it's, you know, this place, this El Dorado, so to speak, this treasure trove of hydrocarbons, and we need to get there as soon as possible, take advantage of it. So, and some of you probably have seen the maps, and this narrative is came from a paper that was published in 2008 by and it was premised on the U.S. Geological Survey study that assessed the potential of the Arctic region for oil and gas production. So some of you probably have heard about shipping and what a great idea it is, according to some, to actually ship goods and goods from, especially from Asia to Europe to the US, across the Arctic Ocean. So the probably the sexiest Arctic narrative is the race for Arctic resources and the business opportunities. According to my count, there is at least one article in every, I would say, quarter in a major publication that highlights different developments in terms of defense, in terms of military buildup, and the underlying rationale for that is the resources that the Arctic contains. So another popular narrative is that because the Arctic is the Arctic Ocean, there's, as you know, there's no continental or significant land mass. International law dominates, right? So if it's international waters, international law. So let's talk about the issues of governance from that perspective. So that is the popular Arctic narrative or popular Arctic narratives. Well, let's move on to what I think is the narrative should be. So on my right-hand side is a chart. It's the only chart, so you will not miss it. That actually summarizes the percentage of undiscovered resources that comes from the aforementioned 2008 study. And the actual discovered oil and natural gas fields, the fields currently in production and fields have yet to commence production. So based on this chart, it's reasonable to conclude that the Arctic and the subarctic is not a new energy frontier. It's a well-traveled route. It's what I like to refer to as the more of an energy backyard or a playground than the actual new energy frontier. So now let me also address the narrative about the this vast resources. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a direct quote from the 2008 study. And here's the quote. Quantitative assessments were conducted in those geologic areas considered to have at least, I'm going to emphasize this, a 10% chance of one or more significant oil and gas accumulations. For the purposes of this study, a significant accumulation contains recoverable volumes of at least 50 million barrels of oil and or oil equivalent natural gas. The study included only those resources believed to be recoverable using existing technology, but with the important assumptions for offshore areas that the resource would be recoverable even in the presence of permanent sea ice and oceanic water depth. So another very, very important point that I would like to emphasize, no economic considerations are included in these initial estimates. So the near certain language that some of you have heard from popular media outlets is in fact not very certain. So 10% chance or more, it's a crapshoot. Effectively, the fact that the economic considerations are not taken into account is another major blow to that perceived certainty. So economic considerations is what actually makes an estimated resource into a reserve. If you cannot prove that something is economically recoverable, then it's no longer feasible. And third is that there is a presumption, even though the technology is existing, and this is how resource and reserve estimates are being made, you have to make them not with laser beams and atomic shovels and future technology, or whatever future technology you can envisage in your head, but with the technology that exists right now. However, there is this caveat that there is a presumption that you can extract, you can explore and extract in standing ice, which is a big, ginormous if. So that is the sort of the downfall of this narrative. So we don't know. The answer is how much oil, how much gas is in the Arctic, including offshore Arctic, is that we simply don't know. There's some chance that there can be significant discoveries, but we will not know until we actually go and look and explore and maybe even develop some of the fields. So another sort of argument about the feasibility, about the business opportunities of Arctic resources, is that Arctic oil thus far has been what I call a balance sheet oil. So the cost of the existing Arctic projects have been steep, if not astronomical. So then there's a question, why would you want to ever go somewhere? Well, there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is that one of the ways that oil and gas companies are valued is by their booked reserves. And in order to have a booked reserve, you need to prove that you have done some exploratory activity, that you have made some major discovery, and you can book it. So if you book a reserve, your value automatically go up. So even though you might have not drilled a single meter of a well and extracted a single drop of oil, but if you have booked something, production notwithstanding, your value of your company, the value of your stock will likely to go up. So another point that I would like to make is on shipping. Shipping in the Arctic.
One question, Roman, because we had the question whether that's still the right slide. There was unclarity. Some people asked whether you wanted to advance the slide or whether that was still the slide we were talking about. That was just a question that came up. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. So I'm on slide 3 that has a chart that basically shows the percentage of undiscovered resources.
Then we're still all good. We're still on the right slide.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. All right. So shipping. So again, shipping in the Arctic is basically makes sense if you either have a large fleet of very powerful icebreakers, which only the Russian Federation really has, and then it adds obviously costs, or you don't have any ice. So now we do have ice in the Arctic, so year-round navigation in the Arctic, across the Arctic, is incredibly hard. So, and the last point that I would like to emphasize is the A5 and A8. So A5 is referred to the 5 Arctic littoral states, and these are the states we are going to talk about today, and A8 refers to the Arctic states in general, the permanent members of the Arctic Council, the state members, sovereign members of the Arctic Council. And in addition to the countries that we're going to talk about, these countries include Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. So there is quite a bit of disagreement about the A5 and A8 in terms of what law applies and whether there should be any kind of an international agreement on how to proceed about developing hydrocarbon resources in the Arctic. As of today, the Ilulissat Declaration that was signed in 2008 by the A5 still stands, which confirms that the primary international treaty that applies is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And by that convention, the A5 countries have jurisdiction over continental shelf, effectively offshore areas of the Arctic Ocean, and therefore the governing law is the law of those Arctic littoral states. All right, so let's move on, and very quickly I want to just show you the sort of the description of the or not description, but the sort of the argument against the narrative that it's a new energy frontier. So here's the breakdown of oil and gas production in the Russian Federation in the Arctic and subarctic. So what I would like to draw your attention to is this number 95% and 77%. So this is how much of oil and gas, 95% of all Russian gas and 77% of all Russian oil that comes from the Arctic and subarctic. So that makes Arctic, again, not an last energy frontier, but a very well developed oil and gas province. All right, let's move to the individual countries. So what is happening in the Arctic littoral or Arctic coastal states? So Canada, what is happening in Canada? A lot is happening in Alberta with the oil or tar sand. Not much, almost nothing is happening in the Arctic. However, the Canadian Arctic has seen quite a bit of activity in from the 1960s through the 1980s. Predominantly exploratory activity. There was at least one project that produced natural gas, but it was producing for a small village. There was one oil field that was developed, but it was a rather small field. There was one pilot shipment of oil, but other than that, not much. So the most recent Arctic project that the development of which has been considered for over 40 years, no, actually more than 40, 50 years, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. It's my understanding that it is shut down for good. So the point of this pipeline project was to bring the natural gas in this area to the province of Alberta, and predominantly for the reason of powering the tar sand and oil sand production. So currently not much going on, a lot of history, but no current developments. So nonetheless, how does Canada approach to its governance of oil and gas? So let me introduce you to three types of regulatory systems. The first type is the prescriptive system, when the sovereign, the government, tells you or tells an oil and gas company exactly what to do. For example, your installation has to be this many meters tall and this many meters wide. Your pipe must be 50 millimeters thick, those kind of things, right? So that's a prescriptive system. The second type of system is the so-called performance-based, and this is sort of an emergent and it's an emergent and more and more popular system, where the government tells you, here are the requirements in terms of the outputs, here are the goals, and we might even recommend a standard for you, oil and gas company, to follow. However, the goal is for the company to develop something, to develop approach to meeting this goal themselves. The best example I can give you was given me by a former Shell employee, a high-ranked employee, who was actually, started his career as a sailor in Scotland. So he said, okay, an example of a performance-based system would be the government says you have 4 minutes to get a man out of freezing water. So that is the goal. Whatever the company, however the company approaches to meeting this goal is up to the company. But if the company does not have a system in place and gets audited, the company usually suffers dire consequences. The third legal and regulatory system is it's called the self-regulation system. So there are countries that don't have robust legal and regulatory systems, and the oil and gas company comes in and says, oh, we have really nothing to comply with, but we still need to uphold our international reputation or comply with some standards. So we will just going to get the best standards, industry standards we have, and we're going to follow them. So Canada represents a hybrid, more on the prescriptive side system. The main agency is the National Energy Board. So this is the jurisdiction you see here of the National Energy Board. But unlike other countries, Arctic countries, it also has this significant regional component to it. So, and you see the jurisdiction of the regional energy boards, regional energy agencies, and in particular, Canada, Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, and Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board. So the Canadian legal system is, or the applicable, I should say, legal and regulatory framework is well organized. It's pretty straightforward, but we don't know about the quality of it, at least in relation to the Arctic, because it's pretty much hasn't been tested. So we don't know how good it will be, how those standards and how those prescriptive regulations will be. Well, let's move east from Canada, and let's go to Greenland/Denmark. So the reason why I have slash between Greenland and Denmark, some of you probably know that Greenland has a special status in the Kingdom of Denmark. So in short, Denmark retains sovereignty over international relations and defense, and Greenland, pursuant to the legislation that I will highlight in the next slide, has the jurisdiction over domestic affairs and over resource extractions. So there was some exploratory activity in Greenland in the 1970s. So the big splash was made by a Scottish company called Cairn Energy in 2010. And if you go back to 2010, 2011, 2012, the news from Greenland in relation to oil development went from great to terrible. So Cairn Energy moved in, discovered some oil, but did not discover enough of it, i.e. in commercial quantities. So the other companies came in, namely Statoil, and took those licenses and license blocks off Cairn's hands, and they were also unsuccessful in finding oil in commercial quantities. So BMP is the Bureau of Mineral and Petroleum. It's the main regulator in Greenland. So those failures notwithstanding, BMP plans to conduct another licensing round in 2018. As a matter of fact, they're currently soliciting applications for license blocks, predominantly in this area. I'm not sure if anyone will even bother to apply because the history is not on the BMP's side. So very quickly, how does Denmark or Greenland rather approaches to governing oil and gas extractions? So the system that Greenland employs is basically mostly performance-based, and this is the name of the legislation that actually asserts the sovereignty over resource extraction Greenland's sovereignty over resource extraction. What's so interesting about it is that there is an offset system that is written into the legislation that says, well, whatever you make of the revenue from oil and gas exploration and extraction, we will offset that with the subsidy that the Greenland annual subsidy receives from Denmark. So BMP is really one-stop shop. You usually see at least two agencies that are involved. In Greenland, it's only one, because it's such a small autonomy or small country. BMP does not have the capacity to have a full-blown basically legislation on every single step and every single contingency. So it was interesting to see BMP promulgating regulations as right before the next phase would begin. So first they had regulations that governed seismic activities, then they moved into exploratory activities, and I'm not even sure that their production and decommissioning regulations are in place. So to further minimize the cost of sustaining this sort of commitment, this regulatory commitment, the Greenland government heavily relies on the Norwegian standards, on the Norwegian model. So a lot of what you see is just references to Norway. All right, the United States of America. So what is happening? What is the new development? So probably the most interesting development, in my view, is the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation, or AGDC, and what this corporation is trying to accomplish. So for some of you that are familiar with the oil and gas production in the United States, the largest oil field in the United States is actually not in Texas. Sorry to disappoint those Dallas fans. It was a TV show for those who are significantly younger than me called Dallas, about oil people in Texas. So it's actually Prudhoe Bay, and it is located in Alaska. So that oil field, Prudhoe Bay, or oil fields that base in this province, is connected to the non-Arctic part of the state by the Trans-Alaskan pipeline system that basically is pictured here, not in the best state here, because one of the Alaskans decided to go hunting and hit that pipeline with a bullet, and this is what happened. So, but anyhow, so it's a very large pipeline with a capacity of 2 million barrels per day. It is as old as I am. It was commenced in 1970. It was commissioned in 1977. The problem with this thing is that it's the production from Prudhoe Bay, even though it has exceeded at this point 14 billion barrels of oil, has been on the decline. So if you can't fill up a pipeline, especially a big one like TAPS, you inevitably spend a lot of money on running that pipeline and cleaning that pipeline and whatnot. At some point, you can't even use the pipeline. So it's been the objective of the Alaskan government to fill that pipeline with oil. So why is AGDC is an interesting development is because natural gas usually follows oil. It's usually where oil is. So we're talking about wet natural gas that is within this hydrocarbon mixture. So because there was no pipeline from Prudhoe Bay, companies were reinjecting the natural gas that was produced along the side with oil back into the fields. So there is a glut of natural gas, but there's no way to get it out. So this group, AGDC, is trying to develop a project that will take the natural gas from Prudhoe Bay to southern Alaska and basically liquefy. Some of it will go and stay in southern Alaska and will supplement the dwindling production from the Cook Inlet fields. And some of it, but most of it, will go to Eastern Asia, including China. So it's a very interesting project. I don't know how successful it will be. I discussed this project with my fellow energy nerds yesterday on Twitter, and we concluded that it's not probably going to go well. So some of you probably have heard about the opening of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or UNWAR. Again, big question marks to what extent there's any oil there. The data that we have is very, very limited. Also, the Trump administration reversed to the Obama administration policy. It does want companies to go back to the Arctic offshore and start selling offshore leases. So it's currently under consideration in the 5-year plan developed by the Department of the Interior. So to what extent the companies will be back, we don't know. The reason for that is because the last major Arctic expedition on the U.S. offshore, Arctic offshore, was by Shell. Some of you probably remember. Shell started its activity in Alaska in the mid-2000s, and then their license, well, not just their license, their permits were suspended. They had to fix a bunch of things. There was a grounding of their oil rigs. There was a bunch of things for which I don't have the time. But this story was, I'm sure someone is working on a book about that. But the bottom line is that Shell went back to the Arctic in 2015, drilled a couple of wells, and said no. So the price tag for that expedition was $7 billion, and no oil was produced. No even production wells were drilled, only exploratory wells. So currently, and this is a fun fact for you, so when you hear that the Russian field called Prirazlomne field is the first Arctic offshore field, you can say, it's not true. So there are offshore fields in Alaska. So those fields are located offshore, or they extend to offshore, and the drilling operations actually occur offshore, but they occur on artificial islands. So the North Slope, the reason why it's called slope is because it's a very, very low grade sort of descent into the Arctic abyss. So very shallow waters, which enables the construction of artificial islands. So there are effectively offshore oil platforms located offshore from these fields: North Star, Endicott, Uguruk, Nikachuk. So that's what's going on in the United States. So now there's a sort of a narrative again that the United States has a bit of a, at least on the environmental side, I've heard that has a patchwork system that is favorable to oil and gas companies. That cannot be true. Farther from the truth. I think that the United States has probably the most robust and the most sort of deliberate system. It is premised on the federal jurisdiction. So the federal jurisdiction, the jurisdiction over offshore 3 miles off the coast is the federal jurisdiction. So it is premised on the federal statute called the Outer Continental Land Shelf Act. It's the process through which a company needs to go through to actually produce oil on Arctic, or maybe not Arctic, but just offshore, is very, very elaborate. It's a 4-step process. It starts with a 5-year plan. It goes through the lease acquisition in the United States, the document that sort of captures the right to extract oil and gas is called lease, not license, as it it's called in the rest of the world pretty much. So then it's a lease sale, then there is a development plan, and then there is a production plan. So those are very, very, very elaborate steps that require a lot of permitting, a lot of paperwork, a lot of consultations. Other federal statutes apply, such as the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act. The states have a very, very strong position under the statute that is called Coastal Zone Management Act. Basically gives the states the right to veto any development, oil and gas development, that is not consistent with its coastal zone management plan. Unfortunately, the state of Alaska decided not to renew its coastal zone management program. So, but the other states have. So when you hear that, oh, there is a, Trump wants to develop this or Trump wants to develop that off the coast of California, it's it's a very long shot, for the Department of the Interior to actually go through with that because of the consistency review, because there is a significant barrier that can be overcome, but it's hard to overcome for oil and gas development offshore in the United States. So the main agencies, as I mentioned, one of them is the Department of the Interior, DOI. The two are sub or agencies within the Department of Interior, and they're a byproduct of the regulatory reform in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon accident, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE. So this is very briefly about the United States. Let's move to Norway. And I'm looking at my time. I've been talking for 35 minutes. That excludes the introduction by Max. So I'll try to speed up. So Norway, all the production in Norway, oil and gas production, occurs offshore. So everything. There's not a single onshore well that is known to me. So what's interesting about the Norwegian experience is that Norway had the first Arctic natural gas field called Snøhvit, and it's located about northwest of Hammerfest. So it keeps producing and expanding. So there are satellite fields that have been plugged into this infrastructure. In March 2016, Eni Norge, it's an Italian company, it's a Norwegian branch of an Italian oil company, commenced the Goliath field, and the platform that produces is pictured right here. It's a first Arctic purpose-built platform. It was built in South Korea. So it's even though it's it's a real oil field and produces oil in commercial quantities, it's more of a demo field in terms of the price, in terms of the cost that the Eni and the Norwegian government had to put into it. So, but nonetheless, it is there and it is producing. So Norway is trying to continue its success, or according to environmentalists, failure of managing its oil and gas resources offshore. So we still see there were even licensing rounds during the very low oil prices. The big disappointment came in 2013 when Statoil lost between $1 and $2 billion on its exploratory campaign, but the Norwegian government is still charging with licensing rounds, and we see some uptake in the number of companies who want to at least go and look for oil and gas on the Norwegian continental shelf. So the 2018 licensing round is happening right now. All right, so probably the most advanced regulatory and legal system in terms of the governance of oil and gas extraction. So it's based on the holy trinity, labor, industry, and regulatory agencies that sort of juxtaposed and have competing interests, so they have to negotiate, right? It's not predominantly industry driven, so labor has a lot to say and the government has a lot to say. So it's a very structurally robust and logical legal and regulatory framework. It makes perfect sense. One of the reasons why it makes sense that it's performance-based, and the reason why it's performance-based is because the Norwegian government did not have resources to basically put a person with a clipboard on every single installation, every single facility. So they had to figure out a less resource-intensive yet as effective way to govern some of the permitting, some of the technical aspects. So they implemented the performance-based system, which many countries, including the United States, are trying to borrow from. So there are 4 main agencies. They're listed here. The probably the main one is Petroleum Safety Authority, PSA. Also the Climate and Pollution Control Agency and others. Okay, so let's move to the last country, and it is Mother Russia indeed. Again, I showed you how much oil and gas is currently produced. In Russia, in the Russian Arctic and Subarctic, the vast majority of it is produced onshore from the legacy supergiant fields. So Russia is trying to supplement, or just to develop, or to substitute, or to replace this capacity, because those are mature, declining fields. So what's new? Well, 2 things really, and then there's a third thing I would highlight. So, well, first of all, there are some developments onshore that is worth noting, and they are in Western Siberia, usually satellite fields. So then there is the first proper Arctic continental shelf development called Prirazlomne. Some of you have heard of it. It made the news in 2013 when Greenpeace activists scaled it and then got arrested and then got pardoned by this guy, this charming gentleman, right before Christmas. So it was discovered in 1989. It came online in December 2013. How much it costs, I can only guess what the real cost of that oil is, but my estimate is that it's way over $100 per barrel, which is much higher than the current oil price. So probably the most successful one, yet also a Russian project in the Arctic, is Yamal LNG. But it's also heavily subsidized, or it has been heavily subsidized by the government. The first shipment occurred in 2017. So this big tanker, it's actually an ice-breaking tanker, so it can go through Arctic ice. And a fun fact for you, the name of this tanker is Christophe de Margerie, which is the name of the ex-Total CEO that was friend of the Russian government and died tragically in a airplane crash in one of the Russian airports, one of the Moscow airports. So, but this project is up and running. Some people, some outlets herald it as a success. It's so heavily subsidized, I would never consider it as that much of a success. So another project, very quickly, is the South Kara Sea project, and that is the project that was interrupted by the sanctions imposed on the Russian oil and gas sector in the aftermath of Russia's annexation of Crimea, so on and so forth. All right, so very quickly, the legal system in the Russian Federation is de jure, it's prescriptive, but de facto, or in reality, with elements of self-regulation. So it's complex and it's convoluted. I've been studying this system since 2010, and I still am perplexed often by the fact that it's somehow it's functioning. It is convoluted. Some parts are fine, some parts work, some others do not work, but the the bottom line is that if the Russian government wants any oil and gas activity to occur, they will make sure it will occur. Environmental concerns, social concerns notwithstanding. So largest fields are basically the distribution, the access to largest fields. They're decided basically in the Kremlin. It's an ad hoc decision. There are only a limited number of companies. For the offshore, it's only 2 that can have access. So it's a very, very, very tightly controlled system. So it looks like I am about 12 minutes over my projected end time. So I will stop right here. I will be very happy to answer your questions, even though we have about 10 minutes to do so. For now, it's thank you for listening. I wish I could see your faces. I hope I didn't put anyone to sleep with this legalistic lecture, but I'm ready for your questions.
Well, thank you, Roman. Spasiba. And it was definitely very, very interesting for me as well, even though I've heard presentations about Arctic oil exploration and gas exploration in the past, but definitely very interesting. Also, what I like, we're not just the main hard facts, or they're also hard facts, but not just the main story, but also what you said, like fun fact to know, not always that fun maybe, but very interesting, very good to get these additional pieces of information in. Of course, I would have a lot of questions. I don't want to dominate this though. I'm merely the moderator, so I invite everybody to ask their questions. Again, you have multiple channels for this. You can raise your hand, you can ask a question in the question pane, and you can also use the chat box function to communicate. If you want to ask a question, we can unmute you and you can then ask your question directly. As Roman indicated, yes, you won't see each other. It's the huge drawback, but we'll work with what we have, and I hope we can get some interaction at least going. So while we're waiting for people, I see the first interested participant wants to ask a question. I think it's Tuli. I will unmute you, hoping that you can speak wherever you are right now. Tuli, the microphone is open.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. Greetings from Finland. So that's the reason for my accent. Actually, my background is in international relations. And I will participate later this year in Model Arctic Council, organized side by side with the Arctic Council meeting. And the topic is offshore oil and gas development. And well, I have not studied that much about energy policy. So number one, where to start if I should it's kind of role play for us. Mm-hmm. So where to start? What should I read? Is there something you can point out right away? And then I was thinking myself, the role of climate change. You actually didn't mention that much about the future projections. And then if I may ask the third question, is there something like what people normally forget, something what could surprise my fellow role players if I know something very, very, very specific about this topic?
Well, thank you very much for the question. What I suggest about the reading is that what I can do is that I can compile a list of sources for you to read on various topics. Is there encompassing book? There is one. There's, I contributed a chapter to it, but I can also include that. But that will include also, it will provide, I think, a list will give you a better opportunity to see what you're mostly interested in. If you want an overview or if you want a specific topic, and then and I will share it with everyone. So I'll do so in a couple of days. So to your second question, as far as climate change, all right. So I'm going to merge the second question and the third question. So the reason why I started studying Arctic and oil and gas in general is because what I couldn't quite understand or couldn't put my finger on is why there are these competitive narratives, right? So competing narratives, I should say. And one says, the Arctic, there's so much oil, so much gas, so much opportunity. And then you hear this sort of sobering, yeah, we really shouldn't be using any oil and gas. We really shouldn't be using any sometimes start, thinking about how we can withdraw, and, thinking about how to withdraw inevitably entails not producing more or not starting on something new, right? So, and this is how I got into this whole thing. So here's my something new, something that I think will be surprising, is to start talking about basically the some kind of a mechanisms for reconciling the climate commitments with the projected development of the area, of the region. So in my view, there shouldn't be actually much going on right now in the Arctic period, especially about new stuff, new projects. There shouldn't be. Those projects take 30, sometimes 50 years from start to finish. That puts us, beyond 2050, when the world should be, virtually fossil fuel free. So that's one thing. The second thing that I would maybe draw your attention is the role of regional blocs, such as the EU, in sort of influencing what is happening in the Arctic in terms of oil and gas production. For example, the EU is the largest energy market in the world, right? So it actually can control production by controlling its demand, what kind of energy resources it demands. So those kind of things. So obviously, since you are in the sort of doing this role play in the Arctic, sort of under the roof of the Arctic Council, and I'm jealous of this exercise, by the way. So, and I will try to follow and see how it goes, because I do have very good friends and colleagues in Finland. So one of the things is that, so what does the Arctic Council what the Arctic Council can do? Like, what is the sort of the extent of the Arctic Council's influence on the pace of oil and gas development in the Arctic? Because I mentioned, yes, there have been various initiatives sort of to influence, to inform about the consequences of oil and gas development in the Arctic, but the Arctic Council generally lacks any kind of a meaningful jurisdiction over it. So those three things.
Thank you. This was really helpful.
So, and thank you. We have many more questions. Roman, if in only about 7 minutes left in our first segment, I'll hand over the microphone to Dario. And I hope, Dario, you can ask your question directly now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And I just have a quick question, because you were really great in sort of debunking the myth of the Arctic as an El Dorado land, and this draws together all the countries that you mentioned. But I was wondering, if we look at indigenous people living in the Arctic, right? There's the conditions of these people are often sort of really dramatically different. If we look at, for example, Norway, the Norwegian Arctic is extremely rich, and the standards of living there are, really great. And then we look at Canada, and we look at Northern Russia, and then we look, and also the US, the records that these countries have in treating their indigenous people. I'm thinking not only the conditions that they have of living, but also narrative that the politicians sort of bring out to the public. We have put in the shut down the the Ripon sort of 10 years ago, and then Trump sort of using the Pocahontas metaphor when addressing some indigenous people. So I'm wondering if you sort of touched upon the implications that the economic development in the Arctic can have for the indigenous people. Do you think there's space for them, also legally wise, or does it look promising to you, or what do you, if you drew anything from your research? It's hard to generalize, but
so I do, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, my first Arctic project was for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is a member of the Arctic Council. So is that a good platform? Yes, if you want to be heard. But if you want to do something about it, there are opportunities. I mean, one of the most successful checks on the fossil fuel development was actually by a joint effort by the environmentalist and indigenous communities in the U.S. Arctic, when they effectively made the Department of the Interior, the BOEM, to go and revise the environmental impact assessment for the Shell development, and that threw Shell 2 years off its schedule. So I wish we had more opportunities. I wish we probably could have talked about it for the entire hour, if not longer, because I have worked. I just finished the project a year ago in the Norwegian Arctic with the Russian Arctic. So it's an incredibly complicated question. But let me sort of give you the gist of what I think. So there is, in my view, it's also a question of to what extent indigenous people have departed from their subsistence economy. So if the health of the subsistence economy is at risk, so whatever is happening in the Arctic with oil and gas development is frightening, right? So, but then if the subsistence economy is no longer the predominant economy, right? So then it sort of goes the other way. Then there's dependence on oil and gas extraction. So then you sort of become a cheerleader for that. And James Anaya, in his report, he was a special UN rapporteur on indigenous rights. He actually encouraged indigenous people to participate in extractive projects, be actual, not stakeholders, but shareholders in that. So, I wish we had more time. So my answer would be, it's a complicated case by case sort of a situation. So, and it really does depend not just on the country, but also on a specific location and a specific indigenous community.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you so much. And we do have about 2 or 3 minutes left. And Andreas Kramer, you had a question, and I'm not sure.
I love it. Yes? Yeah, I love this. I love this question. So, Andreas, thank you for this question.
Sorry, you have to repeat it because the others haven't seen it.
So the focus was, Russia has built a floating nuclear power plant, a horrible prospect, however you look at it. It is most, it is ugly. So I've seen the sort of, this project being discussed at a nuclear conference. It was probably the last sort of a free or semi-free sort of a conference that took place in Chelyabinsk, Russia, in 2011. And one of the participants in this conference, I brought him from the States, was Peter Bradford, who was one of the commissioners during the 3 Mile Island crisis. So I remember it was a presentation from someone from Rosatom, and they showed that thing in 2011, and he just rolled his eyes just thinking about it. So what I'm thinking is that you have to look at the point of the reason why it's, why they built that thing. And the reason why they built that thing is that because they needed to sort of justify the cost of building it. That's my sort of a version of it. So, and some people got rich by what they were, sinking money into that thing. Do I think it will ever do anything or be useful for any purpose? There's more than enough in terms of other fuels in the Arctic for Russia to bring a nuclear power plant in there. So I think it was just one of those PR moves and ways to sort of to launder some money. That's my take on it. But, you know, does it look bad? I mean, I don't know the design and whatnot, but it doesn't appear to look much worse than the old nuclear icebreaker. But again, it's, yeah, I agree with you, very ugly, very useless too, in my view. So
May I quote that this was a project in order to launder money?
it's let me just put it this way. So if we follow this logic that in Russia you make money on costs, not profits, then it probably was. You know, it's my so it wasn't laundry, but it was you know, it's a very legitimized, not legitimate, but legitimized way to launder money. That's how I describe it.
Thank you, Roman. And that's also, of course, a very good point to end this before it gets too contentious for this session. Thank you, Roman. Of course, you're more than welcome to stay on for the second part of the program with our next speaker. If you're busy, I also fully understand if you want to leave. I'll just hand over and introduce our next speaker. Thank you again, Roman. Unfortunately, you can't hear applause now because all the participants are muted by default. I really appreciated that you took the time to be here and present both on your research findings, but also your personal view on energy and energy governance above all in Arctic nations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Unfortunately, I will have to go, but if you want to get in touch with me, you have my email. I will come up with a list of reading list on the Arctic within a couple of days, probably by Friday, to make sure that I do get this done. So again, please be in touch. It was great talking to you and great questions. Thank you very much again, Max.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you and goodbye. And let's see that we get Jocelyn on the air here. Jocelyn, Joe-Strack, you've been with the Arctic Summer College quite a few years in a row, and I really enjoyed it every time. I'm really happy that you found time again and just fit into your schedule again, even though you're very busy in the summer traveling around. You're a member of the Champagne and Aishihik First Nation and a Vanier scholar from the University of Saskatchewan. You're in the Yukon Territory of northwestern Canada. You were born and raised in Whitehorse, Yukon, and you live there still today. You hold a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and Microbiology and a Master of Science in Geography, and that points already a little bit into the direction of today's presentation. So I just want to say this very briefly. Of course, you're going to present your session, so I will just say the title. It's about land use planning, Indigenous land use planning, leading self-determination and reconciliation. So land as another resource. This is one of the topics that came actually up, if I may say so, in this first session already, both in the question session, but also in the presentation. We're talking about land use with maybe drastic impacts and about people who are affected by land use decisions and who may not be represented always in the best possible way, or which voices aren't always heard in the way they should be heard. So thank you for being here, Jocelyn. I will go mute myself now and disappear and leave the floor to you. And then afterwards, we have a question and answer session again, just as in the first one. Thank you.
Okay, great. I hope, can you hear me okay? I hope so.
Yes, absolutely.
Good stuff. So yes, thank you, Max. I'm Jocelyn Joe-Strack, as you said. I changed my topic a little bit when I was working on the presentation last night. So with a bit more of a focus on some of our energy questions here in the Yukon, but that also very much plays into land use planning, which is what I primarily am working on right now. So I'm a consultant. I have my business, Subarctic Research and Strategy, and I've been hired by my First Nation to develop a land use plan for our traditional territory and settlement land. And I'll get into talking a little bit more about what that entails and what that means. But I've used that project to also start doing a PhD with the University of Saskatchewan and ask some of the grander academic questions in terms of the significance of our agreements, what it is to be, a First Nations person in the Yukon, and what that means for our future here, and especially in terms of land and resources and energy. These are important questions to how we all work together to make decisions about the land, and that's in large part of what my presentation is about here. So I have energy and community in the Yukon, and this is a part of my home here. The mountain is Mount Dekolai, outside of Haines Junction. And so the Yukon, as Max said, is in the northwestern corner of Canada. We border Alaska, and it's a very beautiful place. We have large mountains and large lakes and large rivers. Something that's interesting about where we are compared to other northern places in Canada is we have a fairly extensive road network that brings us from Whitehorse. We can go all the way up to Dawson, and now they've extended it all the way up to Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. And roads are an interesting thing. They bring access, they bring development in all of its positives and negatives. And what we end up with is we drive a lot, and I guess 5.5 hours on the road is just peanuts. We're doing it tomorrow. My family, we're going to Dawson from Whitehorse, and it's a 5.5-hour drive. So, but it has allowed us a lot more activity here than some other places in northern Canada, such as Nunavut and the remote places of the Northwest Territories, which are limited to plane access or boat access. So in the Yukon, the fact that we enjoy roads is a definite, or it's a character of where we live. The other part of where I live and my family is, yes, I'm part of the Champagne and Ajac First Nation here, and the First Nations in the Yukon have done very well compared to other Indigenous communities, I guess, across the Yukon and the circumpolar north. We enjoy some very progressive agreements that I'm going to share a little bit more with you, because it really sets the context of how decisions are made in the Yukon, especially in terms of resource development and energy. This is our Elders Senate in 2008. So quite a few of these faces, unfortunately, we don't get to enjoy anymore. But family for First Nations people is a very important thing. And we have a very large family. So many of those faces there are my aunts and my uncles, my grandmas and my grandpas, my cousins. Actually, a lot of them are my cousins. I have first cousins that are in their 80s. And I have nephews and nieces that are in their 50s. It's kind of an interesting dynamic when you're from such a large place. But in terms of what we work towards and what our purpose is as a people, much of it is about family. It's about the longevity of our people and our culture, the pride and the strength that we enjoy as a community and a unit in being together. And it really provides us with a lot of very deep purpose. And we're on a journey of healing. As I'm sure many of you know, we've suffered through the legacy of residential school, of smallpox, of relocation, sort of in a loss of our identity and what it was that we were to do. Our identity and our purpose was shamed for many, many years, and now we're kind of in this new era where we get to re-enjoy pride and re-seek our purpose and our determination. And it's very powerful. It's very, it's really brought us far. And we have some very good now legal and policy and legislative tools to help us enable our journey together. So to bring it back a little bit to energy, I kind of skip around in this presentation a bit, but because this is the world that we live in. We live between this area of purpose and then this area of living in the developed world, which we're very much a part of and depend on. So energy, the energy conundrum is a good one. I did quite a bit of work as a consultant a few years ago. The Yukon government was interested in adding to our closed network that we have here in the Yukon and wanting to explore development of another large hydro facility. In the Yukon, we have 3. We have one in Whitehorse. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here. We have one in Whitehorse. We have one up here in Ajax, and then we have one in Mayo that provide us with 92 megawatts of energy. We complement those with a bit of wind. It's more experimental, and for show, I think wind isn't reliable here. It's strong, but it doesn't keep us going. And then some of our more remote communities over here in Burwash Landing and Destruction Bay are on diesel, and Old Crow is on diesel, and Watson Lake is on diesel. But the rest of us, we're all connected to a hydro network, which is also a bit of a novelty in the Yukon, the fact that we have this isolated network transmission line system that provides us with our energy. So compared to a place like Fairbanks in Alaska, who are completely on diesel, I think they might be complementing that with a few other things now, but the fact that we have hydro is great for us. We have somewhat more affordable energy compared to other places in the north. With that, though, comes some challenges that the Yukon is having to face in terms of what our future energy needs will be. Right now, we essentially work our system to capacity, and we go over often in the winter. So during the summer, we use very little energy, and during the winter, we use a lot of energy. And unfortunately, when you're on a hydro system, the summer is when the energy is there, and the winter is when all of the water levels are quite low. So we kind of have to make some decisions about whether we can, we could join the network that comes down in BC. British Columbia is directly below us, and they have a fairly extensive hydro network as well. If we wish to spend very, very large amounts of money, we could join their system. But whether or not that's favorable for us is a different thing. We're small potatoes compared to the big producers of British Columbia, which also network all the way down to California. So there's a couple different things that we can think about. But then the other thing too is that, hydro is destructive. It's destructive, and that's a little bit more of what I'll talk about here, a little bit about the legacy of our hydro network. But the fact that we enjoy it, we all use energy, we appreciate our instant heat, and we're reliant on it when it goes down. It went down yesterday downtown. I wanted to order pho, and I couldn't because the power was out. We came back really late from the bush yesterday, and we just wanted to order food, and we couldn't. So, those are the luxuries that we take for granted now are extensive. We ended up getting some frozen pizzas and it worked out. But when you got hungry kids, you do what you got to do, right? So here's the Whitehorse facility. This is very close to where I live. It has one of the longest fish ladders in the world, which is what is on the left side of the picture here. Left, I get confused between left and right here. And I think I meant to show this picture while I was talking a little bit more, but it's nice down there. This used to be the Whitehorse Rapids, which is where the namesake of our town of Whitehorse it took many people's lives during the gold rush. I think I have this picture here. So the legacy of the Yukon has always been developed in the modern way. I guess the Western way has been about resource development and mining and roads and all sorts of different things. So we started really in 1898. There was a gold rush that brought 100,000 people from California primarily to the Yukon. Dawson City was the biggest city north of San Francisco, and people came for gold. Tons and tons of people, and they used to have to raft down the river. Go back here. So they made these like makeshift log rafts, and they brought them down the river through the rapids, and this was one of the most dangerous places along the whole trip, most treacherous, and it took many people's lives. But then they put the hydro dam in. Now the rapids are not there anymore. It's kind of interesting. So our namesake has disappeared behind our energy source. The next big thing was the Alaska Highway, which went in 1942-43 in response to the war. And so during the war days, this was our experience or our impact from that. And they connected Dawson Creek, BC to Alaska, to Fairbanks. And that brought us a road. And so the construction of the Alaska Highway is one of the most significant events in the Yukon in my mind in terms of the people that lived there before. Because before, the only way to get up to the Yukon was along the ocean and then climbing over a massive range of mountains and then riding the river. So the development continues, and in 1950 is when they put in the Whitehorse Rapids Dam, just as Whitehorse was growing, and they decided it was going to be the capital. They put in the dam. They put in the second dam in Ajax in 1970s to support the Faro mine, which is sort of in the middle of the Yukon, and it was a massive mine at that point in time. I talk a bit about mining too for you guys as well, because that's what has built our hydro network. So to support the Faro mine, they put in the Ajax facility, and they did it fairly haphazardly, fairly quickly. The Ajax system is not necessarily a system that can provide great amounts of energy. It's a shallow lake. It doesn't have a lot of recharge from glaciers or anything. It is snow dependent, and but it was an easy place to do it, so they did it. Same with the Whitehorse facility too. They just did it really quickly because it worked. Today things take a very long time, as I heard the previous panelist remark. So the Faro mine lasted for quite a while, into the 90s. When I was a child, I remember lots of people who worked in Faro moved back and forth from Faro. Now it's an abandoned town and an abandoned mine, which has severe acid rock drainage, as you can visibly see there, and it has become the responsibility of the federal government to reclaim, and it's costing millions. I think they said it was going to take 100 years to reclaim it. So it was not a good example of how mining could be done. But it was back in the days where they built up whole towns around mines. So now Faro, there's a few folks that live there, but they try and seek different ways to kind of reclaim their town. So through all of this, the First Nations people were obviously there. And we lived as traditional people up until the highway went through, essentially. And that included being trappers and harvesters and gatherers. We lived very organically with the world and with the forest, and we traveled. We followed the food. So we were nomadic. We didn't have large communities or settlements. We had very small ones and cabins. So families would have several cabins along a trap line or along from their fishing area to their hunting area in the north. And we were north-south travelers. The highway went through east-west. So that's the, I like that example because it speaks to the drasticness of the change that we experienced. So when the highway went through, that's when they started relocating the children, relocating the families in from the bush into settlements, and the children went to residential school, which was not a positive experience. But fortunately, our people have always been leaders, I think. And in the 1970s, so that's right when that Faro mine started going, they threw in the Ajax Dam. Like we were experiencing a mining boom, and we went through another round of development. And our leaders at that time recognized that unless we got on board with the Western way, we were going to suffer. So they went forth in 1973, and that's what this picture is, to Ottawa, to our Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, so Justin's dad, at the time, and presented a vision of together today for our children tomorrow. And I was trying to see if I have my dad's book. It was on my desk, it's not anymore. But it was a vision to ensure that First Nations people had a strong voice at the table for development in the Yukon, and how the Yukon was going to present its policy and moving forward. So I like, this is one of my pictures, together today for our children tomorrow. So that's me and my papa. And he was one of the leaders, and I always like to spend some time talking about him because he worked so hard and gave so much to ensure that I had a more prosperous future, more opportunity to live in the Western world and to live as a First Nations person today, which, I honestly enjoy. And, I'm a PhD student, and I'm a consultant, and I have my own children and family, and, and I thank our leaders of yesterday for that. And it leads into, our continued purpose of the fact that we keep working together, and we keep ensuring that as we move forward with strength. So Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow set off a 30-year negotiation saga that lasted from 1973 to 1993. And in 1993, the Yukon First Nations signed the Umbrella Final Agreement and Yukon First Nations Self-Government Agreements. So today we are self-governing nations, which means that we have our own governments that we've implemented for the last 25 years now. Last weekend, we actually just had our 25-year celebration. And our governments are at the same level underneath the Canadian Constitution as the Yukon government is. And so, that's significant. We're able to enact our own laws on our traditional territory, or collaboratively as in the Yukon as a whole. So that could be laws for justice, for education, for health, for land management, resource development. So for example, if we chose, could enact our own water law for our traditional territory. And I can start to talk about that. So this is my home and how our First Nations people sort of view the home. You can see the Alaska Highway go through east-west, and then all the trails go north-south, pretty much. And I was just down here over the weekend in Klakshu, Khlugaman, and my family originally used to travel this way. I hope you can see my mouth. Up to Huchai Lake, and that's where a lot of my family spent their winters. But we traveled all around, really. But now we go on the highway. So this was sort of our way of viewing the land, and then this is our new legislative political way of viewing the land. Which I like to show the contrast because we didn't view it as borders and hard lines. It was fluid and along with the water. But now we live in a context where we like maps as a world. We didn't have maps before, So, but today we have maps, and we like to draw lines on them. So what our agreements did was they gave us settlement land, which was, during negotiations, we were allowed to negotiate small blocks of land at a certain percentage of our entire traditional territory. And our traditional territory is the larger black line that goes around. And there are 11 agreements in the Yukon of different First Nations. So I'm a Southern Shoshone, Champagne and Ajax Nation, but there are many other nations within the territory too that have different language groups and different culture. So we are, for example, we have wolf and crow clans that, so I am a wolf, my children are wolves, and I'm to marry a crow man. I married a white man, so he's white, he's crow by default. But and it sort of set up how our society interacts with each other. Whereas the inland Tlinkits, just to the east of us, they have 4 clans. They have wolf, crow, eagle, and frog clans, and they speak Tlingit, whereas we speak Southern Shoshone with a little hint of Tlingit. These settlement blocks that we negotiated, there's 2 different types. We have A and B land. And on the A land, we own the surface and the subsurface rights. So if there is mineral development, we own the subsurface, the minerals there. On the B land, which is the lighter green, we just have the surface rights. So if you put a road through, for example. And the remainder is Crown land. And you know, some of our people, they say that we negotiated away all of our land, but what we negotiated was a political legislative framework of collaborative management of the land. So our agreements set out the entire context of how we legislate our resources and our land in the Yukon. So we have a Yukon Environmental and Socio-Economic Assessment Act, or YESA, that was negotiated in the agreements, in our First Nations agreements, that creates the environmental and socio-economic assessment process for any new project that goes through in the Yukon as a whole, whether or not it's on Crown land or on settlement land. And so if a new mine goes through, it has to go through this process. Similar to for water, we have a Water Board and a Waters Act that was only enacted in 2003. Yes, I think it was 2006. So the other thing to remember is that everything we're doing is very new and very experimental. Essentially, we're still trying to figure out how to work together and how the power balance in the Yukon as First Nations people, we enjoy a lot of power. And it's challenging sometimes to determine how to work with the other governments, the Yukon government and the federal government. Right now, we are enjoying an era where the other governments are very much wanting to figure out this relationship. I use the term reconciliation often, but really it's relationship building and, well, redeciding our power balance. And when you're doing something like that, there is a lot of headbutting and a lot of determining how that can happen. The other thing, oh, here's my intergenerational leadership. Okay. The other thing is that in trying to do all of this, we're deciding, you know, what is it, how we make decisions. And one of the challenges is that as First Nations people, we're part of an oral tradition. We didn't write things down. We did a lot of working with the heart and working with what was right for the longevity of our people tomorrow. So maybe I'll show this one here. It was all about the kids, and it always has been. So these are some of our high school graduates from a couple of years ago in their regalia at native grad, we call it. But, you know, everything, our purpose is for them. It was for me, it's for my children. And, you know, still that mantra of together today for our children tomorrow stands strong. And that's not to say that the Western way isn't about that. I think that we do make decisions, but sometimes it's a little bit more short-sighted. We make 25-year plans, 5-year plans. We have a 4-year political cycle, whereas we are 7 generations down the road. And so when we're making decisions that way, it's challenging to apply that in the Western bureaucratic system because it doesn't necessarily fit the 4-year plan. It doesn't fit the budget. It doesn't necessarily go down on paper. And that's just a stark contrast in communication. we require a lot of time and a lot of listening, whereas we also need to work to create the paperwork and create the documentation, satisfy the budgets. And as our governments that we've implemented, we have implemented a Western governance system where we have, but it's modified. We have a bit of a different power structure. But we have like a lands department and we have an education department, and they produce paper and they sit at desks. But we do allow a little bit more time on the land. We do a lot more outings, and we do some family things. But to me, actually, I think sometimes that the Western governance system is a bit damaging to us. When I talk to people about land planning, one of the main things I hear is the desire to spend more time on the land, but the barriers to do so, such as I need to go to work, I need to pay for my power and my energy bill. So we can get into that a little bit more. So as I was alluding to earlier, the Yukon, we've maxed out our system. So this is the past 12 months of the Yukon's energy network. And you can see that the blue is our hydro usage, which, you know, we enjoy a lot of. And then the red is our thermal usage. So we have LNG backup and diesel backup, which we both ship truck from down south, that gas. So it's expensive when we start having to turn on the LNGs. And those LNGs were running a lot. I live really close, as I said, to the dam and where the system is there. And they were on a lot last winter. Our winters have been cold and longer. And so the thing that's happening is we've had a lot of growth. In 2008, we had a exploration boom come through here. So while the rest of the world was in economic chaos, we were actually in a boom. And we saw lots of new houses go up. We've seen, I think, about 5,000 people move to the Yukon in 1 year, which is massive. There's only 30. When I was growing up, there was only 17,000 people in the Yukon in the 80s. And now there's 37, I think. 37,000 with most people living in Whitehorse. I think there's 27,000 people in Whitehorse. So in 2008, we went from like 22 to 27,000. It was crazy. So we have a housing crisis here for sure. And there's not enough homes for people or affordable homes. It's very expensive. So they put up all these new houses between 2008 and since, and they were all primarily on electric heat. Not very many of them had backup. So, you know, most of the houses before that had like a wood stove, or they had even propane. We don't have LNG here. We don't have a pipeline or anything. So you can truck up oil, heat, or LNG. And so all the new homes they put on to electric without increasing the capacity of our energy system. So we ended up sort of in this conundrum now where we're needing to decide how to expand our system. And one of the ways that they propose to do that in an easy way is to upgrade our existing systems. So we have the 3 hydro facilities that I talked about. And Yukon Energy works very hard. They're the ones that operate the hydro and take care of the transmission lines to decide, you know, look and explore different ways to increase the capacity at our 3 existing dams. So to be honest, the easiest one is Whitehorse. Whitehorse feeds from the Southern Lakes, which is a massive lake system. In 2007, though, we had a really high water year. The Yukon and climate change, we're getting more snow, more rain, we're getting more water here. And the Southern Lakes residents were flooded out. And some of them, they live in I tried to find a picture, actually. I couldn't find one that I could use. But they flooded there. And there was politicians that live on the beach there. It's a beautiful spot. But so Yukon Energy, the easiest thing they could do is they could hold back the water at Whitehorse and use that for our winter energy. And that's what we need, right? We need winter energy. We need more water sitting around and available to run through during the winter. And we need to try and not let the reservoirs drop as far. So hold back the water at the Southern Lake system. But that was met with great opposition because those homes experienced flooding. And many of them blamed Yukon Energy straight up to say that it was their fault that it flooded. But I worked in the hydrology office for quite a while. And, you know, it was just an extraordinarily high snowpack, and that resulted in flooding. So the next one to look at is Ajax Lake. And as I talked about earlier there, Ajax is not necessarily a good candidate, but it is the lake that they currently use for their winter energy. So they use Whitehorse during the summer and Mayo. And then during the winter, they run them all, obviously, but they primarily draw off Ajax. So they've put in a couple of new turbines at the Ajax system, but theoretically what they would like to do is to hold back the water here. And this is on my traditional territory. And my grandma is actually from Ajax village, Eshai Man. Man is a lake in our language. And it caused great destruction, the dam. But nobody lives here full time. But our history is deep here. And it's a very beautiful area. It's a bit drier than some of the other areas further to the south. There's caribou. And so at the dam, the Yukon Energy is re-entering, they have to relicense the dam underneath the Waters Act. And to do that, this time, they've proposed to go into a collaborative management. They're trying to collaboratively relicense the dam with Champagne-Ajax First Nation. And so they're doing this co-management relicensing project right now. It's happening right now. And it's going not well. For all of those reasons that I talked about before, Yukon Energy is very interested in the numbers and you know, the technical reasons for why maybe the water should be higher, should be allowed to be held back higher, whereas our community members are wanting it to stay a bit lower. And I'm just going to show you, I have a video here that it's 3 minutes, it's really quick. But yeah, we'll watch it. And this is out at Ajax.
We don't think about right now what we want, what will be better for everybody.
So Jocelyn, just so you know, we cannot hear the sound really well. We can see the pictures. Just so you know, when there's interview segments, we cannot hear, for some reason, doesn't come across. But the pictures come across really nicely.
Well, it shows you, I was going to show it mostly because it does show you a bit more of our culture. I can add some context then. What this video is we did it for the land plan, but also it was mostly filmed out in Ajax, and we had a bunch of folks from Yukon Energy, from the consultants that were working on the technical studies, come up with us last summer and harvest these fish. And they spent the weekend with us and just kind of learned a lot more about who we were as a people and what it was to be a part of our community. And then we had this sharing circle at the end of the weekend. And one of their biggest takeaways was their wish for community, I guess, is a lot of what our outside guests talked about. Was they wish that they could have, you'll notice in these pictures, there's all ages. We have all the teenagers with us, you know, preteens, kids, babies, all the way up to our dear sweet elders. And we spend time together out there, and we learn and we share and we are taught. And the folks that came to visit us, you know, we do that on Ajax Lake, where we also have to move our boats farther. We have less fish. They draw the water level down so low that often they take the fish harvest for the year. So it ends up being really challenging for us. I can share this YouTube. I think what I might do is I can share this YouTube link with you, or it's in the on the presentation. And I invite you to check it out, because there is, what the kids say is really important. One of our students last year for the Settlement Land Planning Project developed this video, and I was just so proud of her for it, and what she accomplished there in talking to the kids about what the land means to them. And our youth are really impressive sometimes. We actually, so we had an assembly just this last weekend where, again, all of our family was together, but we were making decisions about what we should do as a people moving forward. And we do this every year. We call it a general assembly. And our community comes together and we talk about what our government should be doing and what's important to us. And we just had some of our youth come up this last weekend and talk about alcohol. We do, of course, we suffer from our own social challenges from the implications of the loss of our identity due to residential school and some of those other relocation items. And our youth kind of spoke up against alcohol this past weekend, and it was just amazing. These teenagers that you would think don't care, right? But they care deeply. And they told us that it's time for alcohol to stop. And then obviously there's more to the story than that, but and to all of our whole community, we had these kids stand up and address a challenge like that bluntly, emotionally. So, you know, that's why we keep moving in the way that we do. Anyway, that's obviously I could keep going, but I think I'm going to cut it there a little bit. I could talk a little bit more about the co-management with Yukon Energy and Champagne and Ajax First Nation putting together the license application to relicense the hydro dam. It's not going, as I said, it's not going well, and it's just because of these differences in value systems and how you make decisions. So working against the numbers and working against different causes and purposes. The bottom line is that we do need energy. Yukon Energy needs to determine how best to get us more energy, but then it comes at the expense of the land and potentially at the expense of the future opportunities for our children. You know, and so where do we find that balance? And how do we continue to enjoy living in both worlds comfortably, but also with opportunity and strength? So anyway, that's what I'll leave it at that so we can have some time for questions. But yes, goodness chief, thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn. It was really, really good. And I think also very, you know, it's unique insights that we, most of us at least, I would say, don't get from the other presentations. And that's really, really, truly unique. I also find it so interesting to discuss like your power needs, your energy needs, how they're different. Also the different relations towards then hydropower in both as a good and an evil in both ways, and how this is very difficult to say, well, you don't want to have hydropower when you have the choice then with other with fossil fuels actually, and not with wind and solar. Of course, people are working on renewables in the high north as well. We had a person on our Arctic Summer College, I think 2 years ago, Piper Foster. I don't know if you saw her in passing at some point. She's in Alaska, and she works on getting these diesel-powered microgrids to renewables. So of course, slightly different situation because they don't have the hydro benefit, I want to say here, but of course that's benefit means it's just good, and it's not just good. We do have some time for questions and hopefully also answers. I do have first one question coming from Thule, and I think it's more like a clarifying question, but maybe Thule, I'm sorry I couldn't take your question earlier. I think it referred to quite a bit earlier in the presentation. I just unmuted you. If you want to ask your question now, you can, or you can also ask something else in addition if you have another question as well.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Good. Thank you for your presentation. So you showed us a map about your kind of summer home and winter home in north and south side of the map. So how long is the distance between those places? About.
Well, walking along the trail, I think.
For example?
Yeah, it's 130 kilometers, I think, from Huchai to Klukshu. But now if you drive, it's about an hour, and it goes around a mountain.
Yeah. Okay, so it tells a lot about the scale. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Thule. That was a practical question, but also beyond that, also a question about, well, what scales are we talking about? What's the living environment or the lived environment? And I think it is really like the pictures you showed, the video you showed, and I appreciate that you want to share if you send me the link to the YouTube video, we can put it both on our website and also onto the Facebook group. And I'm sure that many of the participants will want to take the time to really view the whole video and also listen, of course, to what the interviews say, since we couldn't really get that in this web streaming format. It's too much compression, I think, of the data. Yeah. But I think you really have a unique perspective because you brace the two worlds in a way, the tradition and the future, and you're a consultant, you work on energy topics, on governance topics, but you're also very deeply rooted in the culture, and that relates a little bit. I don't know if you were there already, but Dario asked this in the previous session about oil and gas development in the high north, and about what role is there or what possibility is there for indigenous populations to not be marginalized when these decisions are being made by other people. And and of course, yeah.
I was here. I did hear that question, and I thought it was interesting. And we have oil and gas potential in the Yukon as well, and obviously along the high coast. And I think the bigger impact potential for us is actually along the highways. And if it were to come from upper in the Northwest Territories, they could essentially bring it down along the highways that would go through our area. But in terms of marginalization in the North, in Canada, the First Nations, many are doing quite well. in saying that though, with a caveat, we we still have our social challenges, and there are those that, I don't know, sometimes I think of them as just getting left behind. But we are not isolated on reserve systems like they are in southern Canada. And that's included in Nunavut and the NWT as well. And I think part of that is because we have such a high population rate. And we came in the era of comprehensive agreements, not treaty agreements, which is what the situation is in the South. So the reserve system, where First Nations people are isolated to reserve villages that have very little opportunity for the people that live there, and they have very deplorable housing conditions. We don't have that system here in the Yukon. We have places that we can live with on settlement land, but often they're within other established villages, and we kind of just are all together, I guess. And the other thing too, as I said, is that we have our agreements and we have our success in that, in implementing our governments. So our people are actually fairly well-to-do, and we have this legislative framework where when the development occurs, we have a lot of sway in how that development occurs or whether it's going to occur. And for the most part, we're pretty supportive of development. Mining development, oil and gas would be a new can of worms for us. We haven't had it come through yet. And as the previous speaker discussed, whether or not it's even practical at this stage. I talked earlier about how in 2008 we had an exploration boom, so we had helicopters all over and coring happening and a whole bunch of folks looking for mineral potential. And now what we're having to poise for is the actual mining boom, because now we're 10 years later, and it takes longer than that to permit and to make a mine actually up and run. And with oil and gas, that would be a similar thing. It takes a couple decades really to make it happen, or at least 15. So we have a few very large mines coming down the pipeline, and they are going through the assessment process that was dictated in the agreements, and working with nations very closely. Engagement is huge in the Yukon in terms of speaking with all of the people that live here and talking about how a project can go through where it's supportive of the land and of the society, and creating the most opportunity for us without marginalizing us. So it's hard with mining, and apologies, that's where my experience lies, but with mining, something that happens too is we end up with, they close very abruptly. So we had 2 of our mines close very quickly here in the Yukon in the past little bit, and ended up with a lot of folks out of work. And they were all trained to work in mines, and then all of a sudden there was no mines to work in. And so, we had girlfriends with single moms that kind of were out in the lurch and didn't have a place to stay. And, I felt kind of mad at the mines for that, and at our government, for our Yukon government, for sort of putting all of their eggs in that basket without providing us with other opportunities. I think it's good that it happens. I wish it could be more staggered though. I really wish that it didn't have to work on this boom and bust cycle, and that was just the nature of it. It would be really nice if we could just always have one operating line and just keep it going from there, but that's not how economics works.
Just taking this a little bit further about other areas in other fields of economic development, and you mentioned that when we talk about renewable energy, wind isn't really a source you can really work with, but here now on this photo we see the green in the background, and actually last week we had a great presentation there about with a warming Arctic, also a spread of green growth, more biomass production, as the biomass energy people would call this. Other people would say more trees are growing, but nevertheless is is biomass also as a heat source, but also as a source for electricity generation an issue you talk about? Because that's local and that might be available year-round. Is that explored?
Yeah, we had a fairly significant beetle infestation come through the Yukon, sort of subsiding now, but many of our trees are standing dead. And so in Haines Junction, actually, my sort of alternate community, they did quite a bit of exploration on the feasibility of biomass and using those dead trees. And it just never came out to be economically favorable, unfortunately. It was very costly to go harvest the trees for little feedback from the grid. Something else I think that's challenging for us is the fact that our grid is so cheap right now. And so the reason why it wasn't feasible is because it was always cheaper just to use the hydro energy. If you're in a place where you're just reliant on the diesel, then you could start thinking about it in a way where it's actually competitive. One of our diesel reliant communities did just put up a windmill, which is great. And hopefully it can complement their diesel system and provide them with a bit of relief there. The challenge with wind, of course, is that it's inconsistent energy. The nice thing about hydro is it's flip a switch and you have it. Same with diesel. LNG takes a bit of a warm up. So there's those challenges there. I think it's coming. Trying to complement with the renewables, there just needs to be a way where it's consistent and reliable. Right now the wind and solar come and go, and solar, well, in the winter we don't have a lot of sun here. And I'm sure some of the previous speakers spoke to that as well. And then it's just not always windy, but it can be very, very cold. So those are kind of the challenges that we work with in terms of trying the alternate energy sources. But yeah, hydro is reliable and cheap.
Of course, and of course that's you always have to use what's feasible and possible. And I think it's probably true the conditions are very different, especially in the extreme seasons, right? I mean, now you have the picture up from the summer months, and that's a whole different story in the deep winter, definitely. You mentioned like dependency on the mining sector, and I know that's not technically the main topic of the session, but I'm still curious because that's like the question, which way should we go, or what other alternatives should we pursue? Because obviously it's not a very not a brilliant idea to say we complement the mining with oil and gas drilling, because you go from one boom and bust industry to another, plus you have environmental damage and maybe health damage. What do you see as viable options, also looking at population health and psychological, having a job that makes people happy? What do you consider as options, or what is your vision for the future?
Mm-hmm. The Yukon is founded on mining, for sure. We are a mining area. And anytime that we've seen drastic development and growth, it has been in association with mining. So, I try and always remember that we have a really nice hospital with lots of machines and things to keep us healthy that are largely donated and supplied by the mining industry. So, I'm glad that we don't have to fly down south for, a scan. And that's just an example of how I feel that the mining industry has supported us. Sometimes I think it happens very quickly and not always well planned, but in terms of the growth and the secondary outputs from the mining industry. So that's things like the fact that all of our houses are on electric, and now it's putting huge strain on our energy system, even like our cell phones, I guess, and all the things that we plug in. Those are things that we didn't necessarily think about when they decided to put the mine in. So I think that the growth, that comes with mining, for the most part, is positive. It's just often drastic, and I just wish that there was a way to sort of dampen the input, the economic input from it, because it's so quick and so extreme. All of a sudden, you have all these folks running around with massive amount of money, and not always somewhere healthy to deal with it. And but then and then they cut it off. So I'm not sure what the answer is, because I guess I don't understand the world economy enough. Like, it's on my agenda to read more about it. But I just know that we're reliant on how the money wheel works, and we just kind of have to live within it and all of the repercussions of it. So if there was a way that we could dampen the impact of the boom and bust on our communities, that would be really positive. But, yeah, I know there's other people.
That's a very good fact for anybody working with natural resources, and I've heard that also from Europe, from mining operations there, when they have so much dependency on the world market prices, and it goes up and down very quickly. And I think we can develop further ideas, like I don't have answers to these either at this point, but it's definitely diversification is a key thing for having the risk less clustered in one field. But of course, it's more easy said than done, and especially if the salaries are good, if it's tempting, if it's working, then it's very hard to look elsewhere. Jocelyn, I have to say we're at the end of our time already. I think we could go on for much longer, but I do invite you, of course, to join us for further sessions. I also want to point out already that Jocelyn will be with us in Iceland later this year at the Arctic Circle Assembly. Really excited about this. We'll have more information about this, including the exact day and time of our session later in the year, but we already have this confirmed, and I really look forward to seeing you there. Brendan, who you saw earlier on the screen as well, he will be there as well, and so will be Andreas if we finish the planning for this. So to everybody else, I want to say thank you for joining this Arctic Summer College session. Next week will be really exciting as well. We'll actually talk more about renewable energy in indigenous communities there as well. And of course, we have another group presentation from our participants. So Jocelyn, if you want to join that, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, you can always watch the recordings. And to you and to all our participants, I want to say have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and see you next week on Wednesday, same time, same place. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.